All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk about a very powerful feature of the Catalyst Center architecture, which is CLI Templates. And you might be going, well, Chris, we've used, golden configs for years. We've used a SolarWind config manager. We use some type of config this, config that, centralized configuration, or maybe we started automating a few years ago. We've been using Python and yada, yada, yada. What's the big benefit from CLI templates and Catalyst Center? And I'll tell you, there's a tremendous benefit because Catalyst Center really is all about automation development environment, right? So let me explain a little bit as we go in. So we spent many years at Active Expert, our consulting company, developing Python scripts to help us do enterprise deployments of some technology, whether that was just doing security audits or whether that was configuring best practice security settings for routers and switches or controllers or whatever that is, whatever the job might have called for, or secure access architecture, TrustSec, all that kind of stuff, segmentation initiatives, .NEXT, the normal stuff, right? We had to touch a lot of switches, a lot of routers, a lot of devices out there. And really, we're not going to manually go do all that. We need something to help us automate all that. And so if you had Prime infrastructure, Prime had the ability to have templates and push templates out to devices. The Catalyst Center takes that to a whole nother level. And you might be saying, well, Chris, we already used some Python scripting. I mean, that's great because you know how to code and you're learning how to automate. However, Catalyst Center will help you, A, get the team on the same page because very few network teams and security teams I see out there know how to manage a centralized code repository like developer teams do, meaning that you're all working on the same latest, greatest versions and you're managing who can make changes and push to production versus development and all that kind of fun stuff, right? And it's probably like, since we don't code every day, we don't have those tools. Well, Catalyst Center brings you those tools. It has a great coding environment, whether you like to program in things like Python or Java, you have the ability to do that. But also, coding in iOS is coding, okay? That's scripting. That's what I call scripting anyway. I look at it as more I'm a scripter, okay? And even with Python, I'm a scripter. I don't look at myself as a programmer per se. I know a lot of programmers that's all they do day in and day out. I am a network engineer and a security engineer that knows scripting, okay? Now, that's a very powerful combination whenever you put those things together. So let's take a look at what Catalyst Center does for us. Now, before we jump into the Catalyst Center GUI and all that kind of fun stuff, let me just preface this conversation by saying anytime I'm going to do golden configurations, right? So back in the day, whenever I first started working with enterprise networks, we had to deploy, let's just say 24, 3 switches, right, that came in on a truck. Well, we want to make sure that the configurations are consistent, that the code on those switches is consistent. They don't always ship with the same code levels, all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, you could have bugs that pertain to one switch and not the other. We want things to work consistently throughout the enterprise. That's another thing Catalyst Center helps us with, right? But one of the things you've got to remember is once you start getting in the automation game and you start standardizing and truly standardizing on configurations and change control and all that kind of fun stuff as a network engineer, you start realizing, hey, there's probably some design things, even though I took the time to design a nice enterprise network and we've got these layered approach, right? We used access blocks, distribution blocks, core blocks, data center, fabric blocks, all that kind of stuff. We used all that great, design concept. But did we ever take the time to say, on an access switch, all the access ports are only going to be used for network access, meaning endpoints, okay, or users. But I'm not going to use any of my access ports for things like trunks or uplinks or server connections or switch connections, right? Did you put anything in place like that? A lot of organizations we still work with today, whenever we first come in and we start doing projects, we realize, hey, they don't really have standards defined for wired and wireless networking. Like they've got standards as far as the design. We want to follow a enterprise campus building block structure for security, reliability, and all that kind of stuff. But we don't have any kind of written guidance for what our standard port deployment is going to be, what standard type of switches we're going to use, what configuration in our switches we're going to use. Because ideally, whenever you get switches like this, guys, even if they're the one-use switches, right, they're your typical access switches, a lot of times they're stackable nowadays. All the Cisco switches are stackable. They've got much better uplink speed if you stack them and you use the stacking cables. But then it goes, well, hey, if I need a couple hundred ports in an IDF, do I really want to do a stacking, or do I just buy a chassis switch with enough blades, and then that chassis switch is giving me plenty of bandwidth between those blades to not have to worry about any kind of uplink latency? And whether it's stacked or whether it's chassis, you've got that ability. But then it becomes, what am I using my ports for? So some people have a topology where they say, look, I'm going to stack my switches, and and my switch closets are smaller, and I've got 3 to 6 switches in a switch closet. So my top of rack switch is going to be for my access points, and that's going to be for any local servers or any kind of local things that are going to connect switch uplinks, all that kind of stuff. But we'll use the stacking cables for the throughput, but any kind of uplinks we'll just keep on the top of rack switch. That's the way I used to do it. And then now that they're stackable, we want redundancy between those devices. So, but long story short, typically what I'm recommending now is that you guys create a policy on how you're going to manage your wired devices. It goes for switches, routers, all that kind of stuff. And one of it comes down to, are we going to use the out-of-band management port to manage these devices or not? Do we create an in-band virtual SBI or loopback 0? Or what do we use as our default to standardize across the board? For enterprise networking, companies should decide on that. Whether they're going to use the out-of-band service port, or we're going to use a loopback 0, right? Loopbacks never go down. It's kind of the reason, yada, yada. So standardize on that. And then it's, if I'm going to use a switch, what does my ports and uplinks look like and trunks look like versus access ports? It's very easy if I say, look, I'm never going to have, a switch connected on any of these access ports here, right? Ports are dynamic by default, by the way. They're dynamic auto everything, okay? So that means that I could be an access port, or I could be a trunk port, or, you can configure it to be a routed port if it's a layer 3 capable switch. There's a lot of options. And then it's going to dynamically negotiate speed and duplex and all that kind of stuff, right? But if I'm doing these stacks and I'm using the stacking cables, it's a good idea to say, look, I'm going to use these, TIG gig uplinks, and that's what I'm going to use for backhaul back to the distribution, or backhaul back to the core, or, I'm going to use that for redundancy for my other switch stack, IDF 1A, 1B, whatever it is. So just keep that in mind, right? And then keep that scalable model in mind for how you're going to design your network, because if you can standardize on that and make sure that all my ports are consistent, it's going to save you a lot of time and headache. Now, for you organizations where it's like, hey, we purchased all this equipment and we didn't really have a plan for how we connected things. So some ports I've got that are trunk, some are routed, some are access. We don't know. Whenever that comes to deploying the more advanced architectures like we have today, like secure access architectures that protects network access, well, that becomes a fun part. We need to figure out which ports are in access mode, right? Because that type of technology won't work if it's a trunk port or a routed port or an ether channel port or anything like that. So we have to be able to have a tool that can help us understand our inventory. Well, Catalyst Center actually should be managing our inventory. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? Catalyst Center should know which interfaces are on which devices, and if they're up or not, and also what's connected to it, and is it an access port, is it a trunk port, is it dynamic, what's the condition of it? So it's one of those things that it's going to have a lot of intelligence already in the inventory of Catalyst Center. So then we can call on that inventory as far as our scripting. But let's start with the basics, CLI templates. So anytime I configure a Cisco enterprise network device, that's switches, that's routers, access points, controllers, all of that kind of stuff running iOS or iOS XE, I am programming. I am configuring that device to do what the operating system will allow it to do whenever I put those commands in. Okay, so that is coding. You are scripting whether you know it or not. If you're using iOS or the GUI, either way, you are scripting. Okay, so what we can do in Catalyst Center has a CLI template system, and it also has a great role-based access control management system, meaning that I can come in and create CLI templates, and Joe can come in and create CLI templates, and George can come in and create CLI templates. And also we could see what each other has done. And if we all have the same permissions, we can edit the work if we need to, or we can update the work if we need to, or we can add new work. I've got a system now. Everybody has agreed that we're keeping our templates in this repository. Okay. Now, if you notice, there's CLI commands, so VLAN internal allocation policy ascending VLAN. Oh, user VLAN. What is that? I don't know what that is yet because it's a template. There's variables in our templates. Okay. The good thing is I can create a CLI template and just be CLI commands. I can be very basic with that. Or if I do want to automate some things and configure lots of interfaces, maybe I use some loops and statements to do that, right? For loop or while loop or whatever it is. So some automation capabilities to do that. Now, the Catalyst Center supports two different languages, okay? Velocity, which is your more Python Apache type coding, and Jinja, which is more Java-based coding. So there's two options there, depending on what your background is. Do I need to use either one of them? Absolutely not. Is this using either one of them? Absolutely not. These are just variables, right? We're just using CLI, and we're creating variables, and those variables would populate by me either entering the data whenever I run these CLI templates or by pulling that data from the database, okay, during provisioning. So this is just an option, but it also gives us a nice editor. It's color-coded to see variables easy and to see, if I am using any type of coding logic, what that looks like. And then I also have history to see when the template's been used and which profiles it's assigned to. I can see who changed it, all that kind of fun stuff. And so if George logs in and he makes a change and he pushes that out and provisions 50 devices, and he's gone the next day, and I come in and there's all hell broke loose and I need to put it back, I can go in there and look and so, oh, George made this change yesterday. Let me roll that back. Okay, so a change control system for my best practice configurations. And since we're storing them in Catalyst Center, we all know that we're on the same page. Now, a lot of us have been going, yeah, we use golden configs, but how often does that golden config become dated? I still, to this day, see clients using deprecated commands whenever they configure brand new switches because they're using a golden config from 10, 20 years ago, okay? And I'm like, guys, those commands and even the ports have been changed since then. We need to be using the new standards, the new protocols. And sometimes, the device will yell at us, hey, this command is going to be deprecated soon. It's still been there 10 years later, right? So it helps us with a lot of those things. And furthermore, if automation scares you guys, which it should, we're configuring enterprise networks that should never fail. Now, if it scares you guys, the cool thing is, look at this right here, simulation. I can simulate what this is going to do whenever I run it before I even touch the device. I can grab devices from inventory and say, I'm going to deploy this to these devices and generate what that config looks like without ever doing it. So a very cool thing once you get used to this, guys. So very, very cool feature for CLI templates. This is one of the biggest, most under talked about, I guess, features of Catalyst Center, in my opinion, because it gives us the ability to automate and simplify our golden config repository, do change control, do simulations, and get our network engineers used to automating together, okay, and get everybody on the same page. So that to me is worth a lot, right? And I've seen a lot of teams who are now being asked to support more devices than ever with fewer people than ever. You need this type of architecture to be able to effectively do that. to take the time to teach somebody Git and change control via a classic programming workflow and architecture would be a nightmare for network engineers, for most network engineers. Unless you're a new network engineer that probably started in coding, maybe. Okay. All right. So let's take a look. We're going to do this in a couple parts just because. But I'm over here in Catalyst Center now. I'm obviously came under design and CLI templates. If you're in DNA Center, it used to be under tools, okay, and was under that for a while. And they moved it whenever Catalyst Center became Catalyst Center to CLI templates, which is better in my opinion. Now, there is a structure that saves your templates so you know what's what. But typically, if we're working on something for the enterprise, we probably want to start with a project name. Just say, hey, this is what we're working on. So we're going to start off and we're going to create a new project here. And we're going to call this new project Secure Network Access, right? And now that I've got that new project there, okay, I can start adding people to that project. So you can see that was provisioned successfully, yada, yada, yada. And I can also start adding templates to my project. Now, with this, we can say this is our base template. But I already have a base config over here, and I'll get into this part in a second, but then I map it back to this project, right? So secure network access, and then I can choose, hey, am I more Java? If I want to use coding, again, you don't have to code, but if I wanted to, am I more Java with my statements, or do I want to use more Python and Apache type statements, right? So velocity is what I typically use, and then you can choose if this is a regular template or it's going to be a composite sequence, which basically I can start making smaller templates and compile them together to create an overall solution, which is something long-term you want to do. You don't want really long configs in our templates. We want very small configs, but we're just doing some examples right now. But here's the cool thing. With Python, if I turn students loose with Python, guys, a lot of times they don't realize that small changes have very big effects, right? So I may send them a script that can do commands for iOS devices, and then they're able to log in maybe the wrong type of device and it run those commands and cause problems because there's not really any safety blocks to say, hey, this script is really for these devices. I'd have to note that in advance, make sure they know it, make sure everybody's on the same page. Well, with Catalyst Center, like I said, it's a great change control and kind of coding architecture because I can start attaching software types. And if I ever try to run this on a device that doesn't conform to that or product line details, I can have device specific details. So if I come under here and there's all different types of devices, and I say, hey, this is going to be for switches and hubs in our example. And we're going to do, I just put a 9 in there, which could be 2960s and all that. But I'm really looking for the 9200, 9300, 9400 type switches, right? And so any of those is basically it's going to have to be an iOS XE device, and then it's going to be for any 9K type switches. And now I've got a new template that I can start working with. Now, a template is just that. It's a template. It's not going to do anything until I tell it, until I assign it to what's called a profile. And then I have to attach those profiles back to my sites, right? So there's a whole process that has to go on here, right? But let's just say I wanted to create a template here, and we're going to say banner MOTD and okay, so let's just say we're going to do this, right? We're going to just write a banner. So we would save that, and we could work on changes over time. It's not until we commit it that things become usable, right? So if I commit this, well, it's not committed, but it's not really doing anything yet, right? And you can export, and there's now some best practices, which is pretty cool. But I could run a simulation here. Okay, so I'm going to run a simulation. I'm going to say this is a test, and I would just want to see how my new script would look. I'm going to put this on a couple switches here, and we're going to run it and see what that would look like. And you can see that, hey, basically I am writing this command to this device. Now there wasn't any variables to really simulate with that, right? So we can do some other stuff with these templates. So maybe we want to do host name, and then we'll say host name as a variable and save. Well then, now I've got this variable over here. Okay, so what's that about? Well, I need to fill out the host name whenever I grab this device, right? So it's a text field, and I'm defining it, right? And you can put some things on here to say, you know, this is switch 1 or router 1, whatever it is, and maximum characters, and I could put additional notes, and I could say it's case sensitive. So let's just show you a variable, though, a very basic variable. We're going to simulate it now, and we're going to say add simulation, and we're going to do test 2. So in this case, it says, hey, okay, well, 9K switch 1, what are you going to put in for your variable here, right? So let's just say 9K switch 1, and we're going to call it CATC. So let's run. So now you can see that this would have generated a new host name called 9K switch 1 CATC with the banner message of the day below it. So while I ran this, right, remember I'm provisioning a device. So now that this template's created, I would choose a device and I would say to provision it, and it would run the templates that I have assigned to provision for that location. And for iOS XE devices that are 9200, 9300, 9400 series devices. So any devices at the location that match that would get these commands now. You see how this is working? But it gets even cooler than that, because Catalyst Center has an inventory of a lot of devices. And I'm aware of all the configuration on those devices, the interfaces, the ports, the uplinks, the protocols, all the config. So I can really write configurations from start to finish if I wanted to, and then use variables where I need them. And then I can also query devices whenever I need to from inventory and those variables. So you can be as basic, like we're doing right now, be as basic of coder and automator, because we're really not even coding at this point. We are, because we're writing iOS, right? But if you look at it, I just typed in a text field to fill out that variable, and then I selected the device, you know, not much to it, right? So I'm helping with that automation. And then once I ever provision this, right, I would get a history of that provisioning process as well. And I'll also be able to audit it and look back and see who did what, when, where, what. So guys, if you can't tell, CLI Templates is a very powerful feature of Cisco Catalyst Center. And the next part, we're going to go over how to amp this up a little bit and configure some really cool stuff. So see you next.